Hello, BA 660. Richard Palmer here. This is the lecture for Chapter 2. I hope everything is going well. I'll be sending out some important correspondence today as far as groups that you will be placed in, as well as kind of an update on the status of our progress in the class. So this video is a little long. I apologize for that in advance. There are a lot of terms and details that I think it's useful to get it out on the front end, and why this makes a difference in terms of cost behavior, cost structure, cost drivers, what that means, because companies spend a lot of time trying to understand and manage costs downward, and a lot of it hinges on understanding of these basic terms. So without further ado, I'll be moving towards that here in just a moment. If you're having any problems in the class at this point, please send me a note and let's chat about it. Otherwise, watch your email here shortly as we kind of progress through the semester. Hopefully all is going well. I'm doing my best to learn the new version of Camtasia, and as I said before, I'll be upgrading all my videos, and hopefully you'll find that good. So we will be in touch. Okay, this is cost behavior, activity analysis, and cost estimation. We have about 5 key things we want to look at. I will be moving quickly through this. I know your attention span to these things is limited. The first thing we want to do is recognize that with respect to costs and how they respond to changes in activity, that's different. There are some costs that are fixed, and that is to say that they're unresponsive to changes in production volume or sales volume. So the rent on or a lease on a factory building is not going to change regardless of how many shifts you operate. As a key example, the same thing if you were operating in a mall. The lease on your space in the mall is going to be the same regardless of your sales level. So those fixed costs are those costs that do not change despite changes in activity levels. Variable costs are those costs that increase with increases in activity and decrease with decreases in activity. So how much you spend for tires as an automobile manufacturer will be a function of how many cars you produce, as an example. As would the cost of windshield wipers and every other component part, it'll go up with the more cars you produce. So just as a simple example, in the manufacturing setting, all of your component parts are going to go up with more production, and so that's kind of the common example of a variable cost. If you were looking at universities, if you had the more classes, you're probably going to incur more instructor costs as you bring more teachers online and so forth. Then there are costs that are mixed in nature. They have a partly fixed component and then a partly variable component. This is usually in the utility space. Things such as your telephone or telecommunications costs, where there's a fixed charge regardless if you make calls or not, and then a usage-sensitive charge. The same thing with water and electric bills. So those are your common mixed costs. And sometimes you'll have contractual relationships and contractual cost understandings where a city may have a certain tax structure and it's a fixed amount for so much, but beyond that level, some other costs will be added on to that. And then finally, step costs. We'll give you some graphics of those. Step costs are just costs that go up in increments based on volumes. So the classic graphic for variable cost is as it's presented here, where there's a monotonic relationship. As activity goes up, so does the cost. And if we the way to identify a variable cost, one way to identify them just from an analysis point of view is, if we stop producing, will that cost go away? And if the answer is yes, well, that's very likely a variable cost. Fixed cost, as I'd mentioned before, in terms of activity and relationship to activity, is inflexible. And fixed costs, well, we're going to talk more about these, but increasingly organizations, a larger percentage of their total cost structure is fixed cost. And that's going to create a lot of problems for us when it comes to understanding what our cost per unit is. So we'll be addressing that here a little bit later on. So, but keep that in the back of your mind. And as I had mentioned before, mixed cost, there's a fixed cost component, as you see here on the vertical axis, the lower left portion of the vertical axis, and then there's a variable portion as well. And that's the graphic presentation of that type of a cost structure. And for a mixed cost, and all organizations in the big picture have a mixed cost structure, right? Some of their costs are fixed, some of their costs are variable. Rarely do you have an organization that has it's a purely variable cost. So if we were talking about that algebraically, we would say if we defined y as total cost, then there's going to be an alpha component, which would be the fixed cost, and the beta component, which would be the variable cost per unit, times the number of units produced, which would be the x in this mathematical representation. Step costs, some call these step costs step fixed costs, some call them step variable cost. I think the distinction is how wide is the step. If the step is very wide, they'll call it a step fixed cost, meaning it's largely a fixed cost, and that with fairly infrequent major shifts, like let's say you went from one production shift to two production shifts to a third shift, and you had to have a supervisor for shift 1, and then if you added a shift, you jump up to shift 2, that would be considered a step fixed cost. But if these steps were changing, based on every 100 units produced, and the organization produced thousands per day, well, that would be considered more of a step variable cost. It is fixed at least for a certain level of activity, and that level can vary. As I'd mentioned earlier, there has been a shift in the overall cost structure of most organizations, especially in manufacturing, where you see increasing amounts of automated production capabilities. What that means is that organizations, a larger percentage of their cost structure is fixed, and less of their cost structure is the traditional variable cost, or hourly laborers, for example. As you shift to automated production, you're going to see more fixed costs with respect to the machinery itself, and depreciation and maintenance, as well as programming and the people to maintain that machinery. So where that creates a challenge is if we produce a product completely by hand, okay, just by people that we hire to produce this thing, weaving baskets, for example, and all the work is done by hand, then we can pretty much identify the cost per unit very easily, because all we need to know is how much time is involved in making it. That's really easy from a cost perspective to understand the cost per unit. Just tell me how much time I've got in it, and I'll tell you what it costs per unit. A few other minor costs. But when you talk about a machine producing all of your baskets, all of a sudden the cost per basket becomes more challenging, because how much of the cost of that machinery are you going to allocate to each basket made? And that's a challenge we're going to be dealing with this semester. Okay, so in aggregate across all the costs of an organization, you've got this fixed and variable component, as I mentioned, the fixed costs being those static costs that don't change with activity, and the variable costs largely your labor, your hourly labor, and your materials input costs are largely your variable costs for most organizations. Okay, when we talk about cost behavior and understanding cost behavior, there's a concept called relevant range you should be familiar with. And the relevant range simply means that as we're analyzing costs and we're categorizing a cost as fixed or variable, that we mean that in the context of certain production norms. And for example, to understand the cost of production, we're not going to be predicting cost at zero level of production or at a level of production well beyond our capabilities or our capacity. So we're usually going to talk about, well, year in, year out, we produce 10,000 units a month. That's what our history has been. And so what we want to understand is what the costs are in that range of production that we usually operate. Because if we do it that way, then our ability to comprehend our costs and what drives those costs and what increases or decreases those costs is better enabled. So the relevant range, and when we talk about mathematically and statistics, if we're going to use regression, for example, then all of our cost predictions are assuming we're operating within a relevant range, and you can't use that Excel regression to predict beyond that range with any confidence. Okay, so and this is kind of this is a nice graphic that kind of illustrates the point of this. That if you look at this from the larger picture that an economist would look at costs structure and cost behavior, they're going to assume that your cost per unit is higher at levels where you're not using capacity. Let me show you what I mean here. At optimal levels, your cost per unit is going to, your marginal cost per unit is going to be as low as it can be. But if you're operating at less than capacity, then your costs are going to be higher because you have excess capability. You're paying for, if you're operating one shift and you've got a machine that could be operating 24 hours a day, then that's what we call excess capacity costs. And the cost of your good units are bearing the cost of excess capacity. Likewise, if you go beyond your normal capacity and the capability of your production facilities, then you're going to incur additional costs there, and your cost per unit is going to go up as you pay for extra storage, as you pay for overtime, as you pay for basically the factory is now crowded, and you're going to have different transportation issues as you internal and external costs. So we're from a cost perspective, we're focused in on this area here where we normally operate and where our marginal costs are relatively low compared to these other possibilities, which neither of which we're particularly fond of. We would certainly be less likely to enjoy or appreciate having excess capacity. If we have overtime, that's troublesome as well, but less. Not too many people will complain about too much business. Okay, so graphically, as we look towards presenting these costs, this is one way to present this total cost line based on the number of customers served, for example, in a retail operation. You have your fixed costs, you have your cost per customer served as the variable cost, and so that's just a graphic way to present it, and it's shown in the text as well. The interesting thing about variable costs, and this is an important thing to notice, that there's two aspects to this cost behavior that you need to understand. One is that variable costs increase in total with increases in activity, but on a per unit basis, they remain constant. So they're very important to notice that the label for our vertical axis has changed here. So in other words, if you're talking about the production of automobiles, the cost of the tires per automobile is the same for each automobile. Let's say it's $50 a tire. You have 5 tires, $250 per car for every car produced. So the variable cost per unit on a per unit basis is constant. If you produce 1,000 cars, it's going to be $250,000. If you produce 2,000, it's going to double. So in total, so it's important to recognize that distinction. Variable costs per unit remain the same, but in total, they go up with increases in activity. Fixed costs, on the other hand, have a unique characteristic that drives a lot of business decisions. And that is because fixed costs are unresponsive to changes in production. As you produce more units, the fixed cost per unit is going to drop, and thus the average cost per unit will drop in total. And so that's a really important aspect of business because it has implications. For example, that if I'm operating a factory and I'm working one shift and my competitor is making the same product across the street and he or she is operating 3 shifts, their cost per unit is going to be lower than mine because my fixed cost is going to be spread across fewer units of production. Consequently, across the globe, for some time now, manufacturers try to optimize their production and get the most out of their fixed costs. So everybody works 3 shifts, if at all possible, because anything less than that means that my cost per unit is going to be higher. And it also has implications for how we compete. In other words, it would be better. I would be better served if I'm introducing a product to try to introduce that product at a low cost, a low price to the customer, and increase my volume as high as possible. Thus, my cost per unit will be lower, and I can make a profit on a product at a fairly low price. What that's going to mean is that my competitor is going to have to reach the same volume levels as I am at before they begin to make any money. And so it's kind of a way to create a shield against competitors coming in. And the little graphic here is just kind of visualizes that situation. What would you rather have, operating 1 shift or 3? And we see organizations going that route of maximizing the use of their fixed resources. So we talk about fixed costs. We also can further differentiate these as committed fixed costs and discretionary fixed costs. So committed fixed costs are costs that we cannot avoid. We absolutely cannot avoid them in the near term. So lease on the factory building or the retail space, we can't get out of that without a significant legal implication. And discretionary fixed costs are those parts of our cost structure that we incur every year, but it's basically a voluntary issue. How much the company gives to the American Cancer Society every year. We may have that at a set amount. We may have done that for the last 100 years, but it's still a discretionary fixed cost. So that's just kind of a further refinement of this issue. I want to get into the issue of cost estimation now because it's extremely important in today's business world where we're working on very thin margins that we understand what our product or service cost to deliver and what drives those costs, what activities that we are engaged in that make the product cost what it does. And so when we talk about cost estimation, we're talking about determining the relationship between the work that we do and the cost of the product. Okay, and to understand this, it's useful, important to make that distinction between variable and fixed costs. And there are a variety of ways that we can do that, in terms of our analytical approach. I'm going to go through 4 of those ways. One way, it's not really an analytical approach, is simply to interview managers about it. But the other ways we're going to talk about, which are most likely preferred, are more mathematically oriented, if you will. But we want to understand our cost behavior for purposes of, certainly for predicting what our profit's going to be going forward in the business. It's also extremely important for purposes of interacting with our customers and suppliers today. So if a customer comes in and says, here's what we want you to produce, and this is the volume, and here are the specifications, and here's the price we're willing to pay, it's going to be on us if we can't produce that product at a profit. If we can't just accept any price that a customer wants to offer us. We have to understand at that cost level, will we turn a profit? And if not, what do we need? How do we need to work with the customer? So understanding cost is extremely important to the survival of the business. As I'd mentioned before, we have these fixed and the variable categories and some mixed cost. How do we make those distinctions? Well, let me pose to you 4 different methods of analysis. The first one is called account analysis. Your book doesn't talk about this, but I'm bringing it to your attention. We'll go over that. The high-low method, scatter diagrams, and regression. Now, when we talk about account analysis, this is a very simple but powerful technique to make the distinction to understand an organization's cost structure or a business unit's cost structure. I take a simple example here, and this is not in your text, but take the pediatric unit at a hospital. Here is 2 different months of spending at the pediatric unit. One where the unit was operating at a very low level with 10,000 patient days, and another where it was operating at a very high level with 20,000 patient days. And just looking at the numbers, based on these monthly figures, you can see, for example, that for nursing care, that as patient days doubled, the nursing care costs doubled. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, well, that's a variable cost. It's a pure variable cost. That if you take the 1 million divided by 10,000 or the 2 million divided by 20,000, you end up with, either way, a variable cost per patient day of $100. So there is no fixed cost component there. The same thing with the janitorial staff. As production doubled, so did the cost that the pediatric unit incurred in that month or in a month. Ditto with supplies, going from 30 to 60,000 in those months of different activity. There are some costs, like equipment depreciation, that didn't change regardless of how many patient days we had. So that's a pure fixed cost. There's no issue about that. The same thing with security. It didn't change despite significant changes in volume. And then there's one cost, the cafeteria, that it's neither fish nor fowl. It didn't stay the same, but it didn't go up in lockstep with changes in patient days. So that cost, we could surmise is partly fixed and partly variable. Well, how do we figure out what part is which? Well, you just need to do a bit of an analysis. First of all, using the high-low method, which there's some notes on in the subsequent deck here. Using the high-low method, we would take the change in the cost over the change in the activity to figure out what the variable cost component is. So the high cost month at 20,000 patient days was $150,000. The low cost month at 10,000 patient days was $100,000. So take your change in costs over your change in activity, and you get a variable cost per unit. We could then work our way back to, well, if it's a mixed cost, that would mean that the total cost has a fixed cost component as well as a variable cost component. The formula for total cost is fixed cost plus variable cost. Since that's the case, then we can work our way back to what the fixed cost must be. If total cost is equal to fixed plus variable, then fixed must be equal to total cost minus variable cost. So in this case, taking, for example, at the high level of patient days, our total cost was $150,000 for cafeteria. And the variable cost component at that level would be the $5 of cafeteria cost per patient day times the 20,000 patient days. So we have 100,000 of variable cost, 150,000 costs in total. Therefore, the fixed cost must be $50,000. Thus, putting these two components together, we get a cost formula of $50,000 of cafeteria cost plus $5 for each patient day. Okay, so now we basically can look at our total cost structure within the pediatric unit. We have two pure fixed costs for equipment and security, and then we have a cafeteria component that even if we're doing less patient days are going to be staff that we keep on in the cafeteria available 24 hours a day to meet the needs of the staff. So we have a fixed cost component plus, as the cafeteria, as the hospital gets busier, they'll bring on more people. And so there's a $5 per patient day fixed cost, or variable cost, excuse me. So bringing our total variable cost per unit to $116 per patient day in the pediatric unit and $750,000 of fixed costs. So that's an account analysis method that's extremely sensible and easy to do. Anybody with budgeted numbers and different periods of time within those budgets can look at them and kind of get a good idea of that which is fixed and that which is variable. They could then use that to, forward what's going to happen next month if we work 15,000 patient days. Where are we expecting to land? We can use that cost formula to make that estimation. So having said that, I've already gone through a high-low example. I won't belabor that again. The change in cost over the change in activity gives you the variable cost component, and then work your way back to what the fixed cost component must be. You might say, the one thing I will point out is that if we have cost data for 12 months of the pediatric unit, do we take the absolute high in patient days and the absolute low and the costs associated with those items to determine what the cost structure is? And your book talks about taking what's called a representative high-low. Okay, not the highest point and not the lowest point, but the next highest and the next lowest. And that's because you have outliers. There's a potential that you have an outlier. The highest level of activity may be really outside of that relevant range, and the cost structure may be burdened with unusual or ad hoc costs. Same thing that you might have on the low side. Okay, a non-representative cost structure. So, and they go through an example, and I'll leave you to review that at your leisure to keep this lecture down to a reasonable period of time. The third category of cost analysis, besides account analysis and the high-low method, is simple scatter graph. And this is actually a pretty important way, and a neat way to visualize your cost structure. And all you have to do is basically plot them using regression or another statistical package. Plot your costs at the different levels of activity. Looks like here we've probably got about 2 years of data. And you can see that there were a couple of months where we had non-representative situations, very low production activity here. Don't know the reason for that. A very high level of production up here and high costs associated with that as well. The nice thing about the scattergram, either for regression analysis or for high-low, is that you can basically drop those off of your analysis and say, well, here's my representative sample of costs and activity, and I could even visually draw a line here and take the slope of that line, taking the change in the cost over the change in activity, and determining a variable cost per unit. So I could just slap my ruler on here and take it all the way back to whatever the fixed cost would be, which looks near zero here, and then kind of do my own cost estimation just visually. Now this is particularly helpful, one, to identify outliers, and the second is if you do have a nonlinear relationship, you're more likely to see it once you put the scatter graph to this. Okay? Ultimately, everything's going to require some measure of professional judgment about cost structures, especially when you get some of these oddballs here. Is that in the representative space or is it not representative? Okay, and then finally, there's the least squared regression analysis, which is obviously a powerful tool for analysis of cost structure. Simple linear regression is when you're trying to understand the relationship between cost and one independent variable. And multiple regression, if you're going to build a cost structure over multiple variables that would influence that cost. For example, if I'm trying to estimate trucking costs, Am I talking about less than a full truckload? Am I talking about overnight? Am I talking about what's the weight of the products? What's the distance? I might need multiple variables to kind of manage my transportation costs in that kind of an environment. But simple linear regression is to say, okay, we've got one independent variable and one dependent variable, which is my cost that I'm trying to understand, and I want to understand why that cost changes. And does this variable explain those changes in cost? And so if I can do regression inside of Excel or a statistical package such as SAS or SPSS, I can do it on some calculators, or I can do it by hand. I've done that in the old days. As you can tell, I'm not 23 anymore, and I can recall doing regression by hand. So the simple picture here, the advantage of least squares analysis is that it's the mathematically best fitting line in the data that you present. So what does that mean? That means that the sum of the squared distances between the observation and the line are mathematically minimized. They're the lowest they can possibly be. That's the trick of the regression formula. So now that doesn't address other issues. We'll talk about that. A lot of people do regressions analysis and they come to conclusions and they can still be dead wrong. But they do have the best fitting line between the data points and the spending and the variable cost. So it is the nice thing about the regression methodology is it uses all the data points rather than just the high and the low point to create this mathematical representation of the relationship between cost and activity. And therefore you could argue it doesn't rely on subjective judgment, but it still will if you're deleting outliers, because that's a judgment call. You still are operating by faith that there's a cause-effect relationship. Just because you have a regression line on data, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a cause-effect situation. So another advantage of regression is that it gives you a mathematical measure of the goodness of fit, known as the coefficient of determination. What the coefficient of determination really is the percentage of variability in your cost that's explained by that independent variable, also known as your R squared. So if you were comparing two different predictor variables and one has an R squared of 0.82 or 82% of the variability is explained by that variable, and another independent variable has an R squared of 30%, well, there's obviously a big difference between how well those two variables are doing at predicting cost. So you can do multiple regression inside of Excel as well. It's actually done better inside of statistical packages. You have to be concerned about certain things when you get into multiple regression, and one of those things you have to be concerned about is how correlated are the variables themselves, the independent variables, because if they're highly correlated, it can cause a situation where your R squared, your measure of coefficient of determination, can be skewed. And I'll leave it at that and let your statistician explain that a little bit more carefully. We're just focusing on simply presenting the data based on one independent variable as the key driver that we're associating the cost with. There's your multiple type regression. Multiple regression, obviously has its place, and you can increase your overall explanatory power. So I don't have any problems with it. The main thing that I would say with regard to regression, and I also, by the way, I have given an example. I'll leave an example up in Moodle for doing a simple regression analysis inside of Excel. I have a sample problem that I've put on Moodle, and I've got a videotape of how you would do that inside of Excel and how you would come to certain conclusions about the data points. So I hope it's helpful. Okay. Now there are things that undermine this relationship. For example, if there's a changing in technology, as you look at the data over a 2 or 3 year period, you're looking at the relationship between cost and activity. Has the technology changed in any way? Is there seasonality in there? Has the price structure changed? Has the cost of input materials changed with inflation? And so there are things that are going to undermine the validity of your regression analysis, or actually give you a high R squared when it's not appropriate. For example, if your costs are rising because of inflation, that can make it appear that as activity increases, it's going to make the R squared even higher because it's going to strengthen the measure of the goodness of fit, because there's going to be an increasing pattern of costs as the volume goes up over time, and a component part of that is simply going to be inflation. Okay, and there's also nonlinear relationships that exist, and inside of Excel you can actually test that with power curves and other types of graphing mechanisms that'll give you an R squared for nonlinear type of models. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, and ultimately the results need to make sense, and what that means is, does it pass the common sense test? Should there be a relationship between an increase in cost and an increase in activity based on that particular cost driver or that independent variable? If it doesn't make sense to the production people, the people that are involved in the operation itself, whatever that operation is, if it doesn't make sense to them, there may be a correlation without causation. It's spurious. Okay, and finally, and this is rehashing what we just talked about, the different kinds of things that can upend the regression model, changes in technology, prices, etc., etc. So I'm going to roll through this a little bit faster. Also, time lags. If your spending data comes in a month after the activity, that obviously is going to have a corrosive effect on your regression analysis. So to recap, the cost drivers that you pick should have a logical, that should be causal, not casual relationship with costs. Scatter diagrams can be very useful to visualizing that relationship, and professional experience and judgment, talking to the people who are involved in the process, they should all nod their head and say that makes perfect sense when you use regression or high-low to determine and estimate a cost structure. Okay, and finally, I want to look at costs a little differently, and this is a precursor to activity-based costing later in Chapter 5. And that is to say, inside of an operation, there are other ways to identify costs rather than just variable or fixed. And there are costs that are going to go up, for example, every time we make another unit. There are costs that are going to go up every time we make another batch. There are costs that are going to go up every time we add a new product line. And so so we have to kind of have a broader understanding of this. And rather than just looking at units produced and everything being correlated with that, your book talks about breaking this down into unit, batch, product, and facility sustaining costs. Now, most manufacturing costs would probably be costs that are incurred to produce every unit. Not all of them by any stretch, but your material costs, your hourly labor costs, some components of your manufacturing overhead, your energy costs, and so forth. They're going to go up with every unit, okay? And they're also easily traceable to the product. So these are what's known as your product costs, your material, labor, and overhead, inventoriable product costs. But as I'd mentioned at the outset of this, that much of costs certainly inside of the manufacturing setting, have gone to an automated format. And so as time has gone by, we see more and more of these costs in this overhead category, which also are fixed, and they are basically relatively unresponsive to changes in activity. So as direct labor goes down and material costs go up with inflation, we have a different cost structure now than we did in my father's day and age, or when I was a younger man, and that creates a need for a different kind of analysis. So what we have seen come in the marketplace with people who have been trying to address this problem is to link these costs with something other than just units produced, okay, especially when you talk about machine-related costs. And so it's no longer adequate just to say all costs are driven by each unit, that there are some costs that are driven by other factors. And so the new format that we're seeing here is what we see presented on the screen now, and that is that there are costs that go up with each unit, there are costs that go up with each batch, and what we call product sustaining or product level costs. That's the cost to maintain a product line. Okay, even if we don't produce it, we have to have engineering support for it. We have to have design, maybe product testing. There may be other things going on, even if we're not producing that product this month. And then there are some costs that really are, if you will, unrelated to the products at all, which we call facility level costs. Breaking these down in detail, when you talk about what we call unit level costs that do go up with every unit produced, raw material, direct labor, the cost to do activities on that product, cutting things, welding, packaging, those are costs that are incurred, activities that occur to make each unit, and consequently we can look at those as being pure variable costs with regard to the number of units produced. However, there are some costs that aren't affected by the number of units produced per se, but they are affected by how many batches we run. Okay, so we should separate out those and put those in a different category. So if we talk about issuing purchase orders to support a batch run, most companies, they don't do endless production of one product. They inside of any given factory, they will do a changeover, okay, where they'll go from making one model to making another model, and to do that they have to change the equipment over. And not only do they have to change the equipment over, they have to change the staging. All the raw materials have to be in place to support the different product. Okay, so we can reduce these costs by running fewer batches, obviously, but we do batches because we're tying to market demand for the different products that we produce. We can't overwhelm them with just one product. That's there's an upper end to that. So consequently, these bachelor-related costs, we should identify those costs. The cost of changing over, equipment setup, first item testing, changes in the staging area and the movement of materials to support this new products, and inspecting those batches and so forth. So all of those are related to batches. A third category of cost, which is not small, is all the engineering support and IT support that goes along with the fact that we have the product line at all. Okay, unrelated to how many units we produce. And then there are costs that are associated, as I mentioned earlier, that really don't relate to the unit at all. The rental of a building, real estate property taxes, factory supervision, these type of costs in a cost management world shouldn't be assigned to the product at all. From an accounting perspective, we have to include that in the cost of goods sold. So recognize the difference. For those who are trying to get a good understanding of their costs for purposes of bidding, for purposes of accepting prices from customers, and price negotiations, yes, we need to know the cost of the product, the cost that we're going to incur. But those costs may exclude facility level costs at a certain depending on how the analysis is playing out. So I just want to keep that in mind. The cost accounting purists would say, hey, facility level costs, we shouldn't even factor those in because they have nothing to do with the cost to produce a unit. So keep that in mind. That's it now. I know this ran a little bit long, and appreciate your patience on this. I'll post this up and look forward to further discussions.